Okay, so this is our Merleau Ponty group, continuing our reading of the structure of behavior. So we are picking up from page 74 of the translation, which is where we got to last time. So we're still on this part about the, so the chapter is the higher forms of behavior. So again, we skipped chapter 1, which is primarily just a criticism of the reflex theory. So chapter 2, and then we're looking in particular at this section about the supposed central sector. So there was this idea in early 20th century physiology that there's like sort of three regions of the nervous system, or three like components of the nervous system. There's the motor, the sensory side sort of is the first side. So like you have inputs from the outside world that affect sense organs, and then that's sort of transmitted through sensory nerves to certain parts of the brain. Then you have the motor side, which is the output side. So you have certain regions of the brain that are involved in controlling motor activity, transmit a signal down the motor nerves to the muscles and other effectors, and bring about some sort of behavior of the organism. And then sort of in between this, so this is the part that that we're talking about now, this supposed central sector. In between, there's some mysterious or like sort of not very well defined association area, or an area that is not directly tied either to the input or the output end, but it does some sort of processing in between. And so like insofar as an organism is not just a one-to-one function between like this input produces this output, like a simple sort of mechanical device. To that extent, then this association area has to do something, some sort of manipulation on the inputs that come in. So either like classifying that, inputs that resemble each other in this respect produce the same output, or connecting different types of inputs to each other. So this is, exactly. So there's like connections. You can connect this to some of the Freud, like the sketch of a scientific psychology, and then also in interpretation of dreams, where he has these different sort of structural accounts of the psychological system, like input, output, and then something in between that does some sort of operations on the inputs to control what the outputs, what outputs are produced in relation to given inputs. So this middle portion is obviously much harder to study and to explain than the other two, because like you can evaluate what sorts of inputs you can control, what sort of stimulus you present to the organism, to evaluate like which inputs this organism can discriminate. Can it detect these color differences or these differences in pitch, and so on. And then you can also observe the motor output. You can like train rats to press a lever or pull a chain or whatever, like different sort of types of motion. But then the middle portion is hidden in some respects. It's not like by definition, it's not either sensory or motor. So to be able to study it, you have to be a little bit more creative in terms of the types of experimental designs that you're using. So then the conception that Merleau-Ponty is criticizing here is one that would try to extend the idea of localization to this association area, or this central sector of the nervous system. And so localization in general just means that there's some sort of relationship between specific regions of the brain and specific functions of behavior and cognition. And so like in a very general sense, of course, we know that it's not the case that every area of the brain is involved in every function to the same extent. It's not, the brain is not just one sort of homogeneous mass that is like involved as a whole in every single activity in the same way. So localization in some sense is obviously true, but the question is like what kind of localization, how much localization, like how are different functions localized and so on. And one sort of very simple form of localization would just be to say like every function that we can delineate in sort of common sense terms, like every we can say like reading, writing, speaking, etc. All these different functions that we can identify in sort of common sense terms. Each of them would have a different region in the brain associated with them. So this is like a sort of very straightforward and simplistic account of localization, and there's a lot of reasons to think that this is incorrect, even given the information that was available in early 20th century physiology and psychology. So one of the instances that Merleau-Ponty cites here is the fact that people that have suffered injuries to a specific region of the brain often exhibit a wide variety of pathological symptoms. So like the case of S, this patient that was studied by Galpin Goldstein, this person, or he had a piece of shrapnel from a shell. He was injured in World War One, so he had a piece of shrapnel in his brain. So it's a relatively localized injury. It's one specific area that was destroyed or damaged, but his deficiencies are like much more wide-ranging than just like one function being destroyed that would be like the function of that area. So he has like in general he's unable to perform tasks that involve grasping a whole, a structured whole. So he can like if he sort of focuses on the details of something, he can like I don't know, maybe trace a line if he's like paying very close attention to the way that it curves and changes direction and so on. But if you ask him like what is the shape as a whole, what is this line a drawing of, he's unable to answer that question. And there was another patient, I forget who it was who studied it, but who had sort of the opposite deficiency, that this person is able to sort of get a vague idea of what the whole situation is, but can't identify any of the details. And yeah, so they seem like opposite deficiencies, but in some respects they're like complementary, because in each case what is deficient is precisely the capacity to grasp the details and the whole together at the same time as part of one sort of articulated structure. So like in our perception, and people who don't have these brain injuries, we can sort of at a glance, we can recognize the structure of a drawing and say this is a triangle, this is a circle, or this is a face, or whatever. And we can, at the same time, sort of identify what are the key, like when you look at a drawing of a face or a photo of a face, you identify like the eyes and mouth maybe as like the key points, and then like one particular patch of skin like to the left of the mouth or whatever is a sort of secondary portion that you don't need to focus on. So like our perception of the face involves grasping what are the important details and what are the unimportant details. Like we can just sort of understand that at a glance, whereas someone who has these kinds of deficiencies would either just have a vague impression of like skin color expanse or something, or they would have like a very detailed sort of series of perceptions of like one corner of the mouth, one nostril, one part of the eye, whatever. So like they would just see a sequence of like details and have a hard time piecing it together into a perception of a face. So this kind of structured or perception of a structured whole is like one of the key concepts of this book, or grasp, more generally, a grasp of a structured whole. So like it's precisely this capacity to grasp a structured whole that Merleau-Ponty is going to argue overall is like characteristic of human behavior and also of other animals, and something that is not explicable or not can't be expressed in this purely mechanistic way of like individual sensations being sort of joined together through association or something along those lines. So that's sort of what we've been looking at. And then the last bit that we saw, this somewhat obscure idea about horizontal and vertical localizations, where he talks about how so there are certain aspects of the brain that correspond in a sort of spatially extended way to certain elements of sensory or motor sides of behavior. So, for example, like this is, I don't think this was identified already at the time he's writing, but in like contemporary neuroscience, there are what are called retinotopic maps or topographic maps in general. So, like in the visual regions of the cortex, there are portions of brain tissue that you can sort of map in a straightforward way onto areas of the retina. So like light striking this portion of the retina brings about an excitation in this portion of the visual cortex, and then light striking a different region of the retina brings about another excitation in a different region of the cortex. And you can sort of draw a map of the retina on the visual cortex. So this is a sort of horizontal localization in the sense that each portion of the each sort of functionally different capacity is localized in a different spatially extended region of the brain. And then there's what he calls vertical localization, which is a little bit harder to understand. But my sort of analogy or explanation of this terminology was that if we picture the brain as a two-dimensional surface, so we imagine sort of flattening it out into one sort of giant surface, you would have, like, in certain regions of the brain, you would have not just one function over each, like sort of on top of each region of the surface, but you would have like multiple functions sort of stacked up on top of each other. And so these would be these sort of mysterious association areas that are involved in a variety of different functions or different tasks. So the patients who have an injury in some of these areas would exhibit deficiencies not just in one task that would be localized in that area, but a whole variety of tasks that area is involved in. And so, of course, the brain is not a two-dimensional surface; it's actually three-dimensional. But we can sort of picture this like stack of functions over each area as like an extra dimension, a fourth dimension of like a functional dimension. And it's in this sense that the localization here is vertical. So it's not the case that each function corresponds to a spatially distinct region of the brain, but instead we have like a whole set of functions, a stack of functions, all being associated with a region that is involved in performing those functions. So I think that's more or less where we ended last time. So yeah, if I can get a volunteer to read. So I think we're just at the top of 74, where there's the section in small type. If someone wants to read from there.
I can read. Okay. H. Pierron clearly seems to agree with the other authors concerning this mixed conception of localization. Without employing this language, he describes a series of horizontal and vertical localizations which intersect in nerve functioning. He accepts the facts that touch, properly so-called, and depth touch, sensitivity to heat and cold, quote-unquote painful sensitivity, bone sensitivity, and finally arthromuscular sensitivity, which psychophysiological analysis dissociates, and whose conductors remain distinct at the level of medullar fasciculi and way stations, do not possess a distinct representation in the cortex. The cortical receptors correspond to different regions of the body and not to the different types of sensitivity. In case of lesion, these latter are affected according to the degree of their, quote, susceptibility, unquote, which amounts to saying, it would seem, that they do not correspond to locally distinct nerve apparatuses, but rather to so many different modes of functioning of the same substrate. Likewise, while pathology permits us to dissociate sensitivity to colors, hemiachromatopsia, sensitivity to volume, hemiastereopsia, and sensitivity to light, hemiaphotopsia, It confirms the fact that the occipital visual area corresponds point for point to the retina. Thus, it seems definitively impossible to assign a special center within the visual area for the seeing of color, another for the seeing of form, and a third for the seeing of lights. And if, following a lesion, one of the three sensitivities is electively affected, it is not because a particular region of the visual area has been put out of use. Rather, it is because the lesion, depending on its severity, systematically destroys functioning beginning with its most fragile forms. With regard to language, H. Piron accepts a series of horizontal localizations more precise than those of P. Marie, at least for the agnosias, coordinating centers for speech, writing, and quote-unquote verbal thought movements, and within this latter, coordinating centers for words read and for those heard. But in each of these centers, functioning is conceived according to a double principle. On the one hand, as a mosaic functioning, on the other, as a global functioning. And from this latter point of view, the unity of cerebral physiology is reestablished across the frontiers of, quote, coordinating centers, unquote. For example, since there are pure verbal blindnesses, it is accepted that the evocation of the, quote, visual images, unquote, of words utilizes certain specialized devices, and that there is a coordinating center for this function distinct from the one which generally assures the visual evocation of absent objects. But this coordinating center is not a place in the brain where the, quote, cerebral traces, unquote, of different words would be juxtaposed, while those of other visual images would be deposited in another place in the brain, and while finally, quote, perception centers, unquote, should be sought outside of these, quote unquote, image centers. Everything demands conceiving of the physiological processes which accompany perception, and mnemonic evocation is the execution on a unique ensemble of receptors of analogous melodies whose initiative is peripheral in the first case and central in the second. Nor can there be any question of distinguishing a center of visual verbal images and a center of general visual images. The coordinating centers which were enumerated above could only be the points of origin in the regulating organs of processes which extend through the cortex to the same receptors situated in the visual area. It would be all the more impossible to suppose individually distinct traces for each word. When a word is evoked, the localized coordinating center is limited to distributing the nerve influx according to a characteristic rhythm in such a way as to play the melody which corresponds to this word on the visual receptors. Thus, the function of the cerebral regions, which are coordinating centers, is of a completely other type than that of the peripheral conductors. Their activity concerns the structure, the organization, the configuration of behavior. Here, the different words evoked no longer correspond to locally distinct nerve activities, but to different modes of functioning of the same substrate. Function appears to prevail over anatomical devices, organization over juxtaposition. The author even appears to think that anatomical specifications, if they exist, are subsequent and result from the functioning itself, since he indicates, with respect to motor coordination centers, it is true that the coordinating centers are not innate and result from a progressive development, which involves individual variations. The first part of this makes sense to me. It's just a continuation of what we were talking about earlier or in the last session. I don't really understand the verbal thought and visual images discussion, though, honestly.
Yeah, I think some of this depends on like the specific accounts of Pierron and Marie that I am not familiar with. So yeah, it is a bit obscure to me as well. But I think the general idea is that like in the case of reading, one sort of simple localization account would be to say that like if you can recognize a certain written word, then there must be a sort of memory trace in your brain that corresponds to that word. So each word would have its own like sort of region, even if it's a very small region, of course, because you can recognize thousands of words. But yeah, there would be some like small portion of the brain that would correspond to the region that recognizes this word. And some of the difficulties with this are that it doesn't seem to be the case, or at least it's not, as far as I know, it hasn't been observed that someone would have like an injury to a very small region of the brain that would eliminate their ability to recognize like one specific word or a certain number of words. Instead, what happens is you end up with certain types of brain damage can result in an inability to recognize words as a whole. So the person can still speak and understand spoken language, and often they can actually write as well. Like if you ask them write your name or whatever, they can do it. But then like presented with a written word, they are unable to recognize it, even if it's the word that they just wrote down. So here, what's been disturbed is not like a sort of very simple localization of each individual word corresponding to a small region of the brain. It's a more sort of global function of recognizing a certain pattern of ink on a page or of dark versus light regions in the visual sphere as a word, as something that has a meaning and a pronunciation and so on. So this idea of a melody or a rhythm, I think is like, obviously we're not talking about it's not sort of a literal melody. It's not like something that is heard in musical terms. It's some sort of temporally structured sequence of psychological and physiological events, and it's precisely the sequence as such that that has a value here, as opposed to just the individual elements. So like this was one of the sort of early, I think maybe even one of the first. So that's a good point. So dementia patients often can remember songs. Like if you ask them to sing "Happy Birthday" or whatever, they can perform it, or like any sort of well-known song, they can sing the song including words. But if you ask them, what did you have for breakfast this morning, often they can't answer that. And even sometimes patients who can't speak can sing. They can like perform a song that they know well, but they can't answer a question like "How are you this morning?" or whatever. But yeah, so like one of the first sort of examples that was used to introduce this idea of Gestalt in psychology was precisely the notion of a melody, because like in a very sort of associationist account of psychology, you would have like perception of one note followed by a perception of another note, and so on, like a sequence of these individual perceptions. And then maybe through the power of association or processes of association, you would come to sort of, if you hear this same melody many times, then when you hear the first note, you come to expect the second note through association and so on. But what the Gestalt psychologist pointed out was that the melody is not connected to any one note. So, for example, you can transpose a melody up an octave or up a major third or whatever. You can play the same melody in a different key, and it's still recognizably the same melody, even though if you play in a different key, every single note of the melody might be different than it was in the first key. So this idea that you are just sort of learning the association of one note to the next one doesn't really capture the way that we actually recognize a melody, even if every single note is different from the original melody. And it turns out like just changing one note in the sequence can turn it into a completely different melody. It doesn't sound like the same tune anymore. Whereas changing every note by the same interval is recognizably the same melody, even though it doesn't have anything in common in like real terms with the original melody. And so this was sort of like the general, or like the first introduction to this idea that there's something like a structure in perception that we grasp over and above the individual sensations. So here, like Merleau-Ponty is using this term melody in this sense of like a structure that is not reducible to any set of individual psychological elements that would be self-contained. And so like in the case of recognizing a word, for example, like your eyes, like there's been obviously not at the time that he's writing, but in more recent research, you can do studies where you put a camera that tracks a person's eye movements as they read, and so like when you're reading, you sort of like skip from like you read I think around 4 or 5 letters at a time, like you don't sort of pause over each individual letter and then put them together into a word. So like you sort of recognize a group of letters together at once, and then you sort of skip over to the next group of letters. Yeah, if you're reading Simondon, maybe you do have to read like one letter at a time to make sense of things. But yeah, so in reading, you just sort of skip from one group of letters to the next one, and often it sort of the group of letters corresponds to a word. So you have a sequence of sensations of light and dark patterns on a page, for example. But what you grasp in that sequence is not like a specific distribution of light and dark regions on your visual field. Instead, what you grasp is the structure behind it, which is precisely a sequence of letters that makes up a word. And like most of us, people who have not suffered these kinds of brain damage and so on, can recognize the same word, whether the word is written in bold or regular type, if it's different fonts, different sizes of letters, different orientations. So like horizontal or at a 45-degree angle or whatever, and also in different regions of the visual field. So you can recognize that a letter A that's like towards the top of the visual field is the same letter as the letter A towards the bottom of the visual field, even though these are completely different distributions of light and dark patterns in your visual field. So again, we're not grasping just a sequence of self-contained sensations that would then be associated with each other through habit. Instead, we're grasping something like a structure which is not reducible to any set of self-contained sensations. And like this, like obviously much later than when he was writing, but like in optical character recognition that we use now, like in this PDF exactly that we're using, like this was a non-trivial problem. Was like how do you train a computer to recognize the letter A in precisely all these different circumstances, like different sizes, fonts, etc. It's something that is fairly well it's fairly easy to do now, but it was like not a trivial thing to get this problem solved. But this is something that the average human that has learned how to read can do without even consciously aware of what the font is that you're reading, unless you actually pay attention to it. You just sort of immediately grasp that this is a letter A, this is the word apple or whatever. You don't and like a sign of this is like how it's actually quite difficult to spot typos when you're like proofreading your text. Like you sort of, even when you like the words that are printed on the page or that are on the computer screen are missing a letter or have the wrong order of letters or whatever, you sort of see it as what you expect to see, like the structure of the word that is sort of intended is what you see, even though that's not actually what's there. So it requires a certain amount of like discipline and practice to actually learn to read what is written on the page and not what you think should be written on the page. And so this sort of shows that what we're doing when we read is not just like a sequence of sensations being strung together. It's precisely this kind of structural, what he's here calling a melody, something that is like a structure that is not reducible to sensations. And this example of reading is actually an interesting one in connection with this last bit that he mentions here about how these supposed coordinating centers would not be innate, but would result from some sort of development. So reading, of course, is not like an innate function of human beings. Like writing systems have been around for like maybe 5,000 years or so, which is much too short a time for humans to evolve like a brain region that is sort of specialized in reading. But at the same time, when you study people who know how to read using like an fMRI, you find that it's actually very similar regions of the brain that are involved in reading activity across different languages and writing systems and so on. So it's as if there is a region, like a reading region of the brain, or a set of regions that are involved in reading, even though we know that that can't be the case because writing is too recent for that to have happened. So it's like there's like reading as a function is something that people are capable of learning because their brains that we have evolved to have have these capacities already. But reading sort of collects these capacities and puts them together in a certain way that allows for grasping the structure of a word, for example. Despite the differences in font and orientation and so on. So like it's sort of taking these pre-existing capacities that evolved for obviously very different purposes, and putting them together in a novel way and sort of building them into this more complex structure of reading that we the average adult is capable of performing, without even thinking about it. Like it's hard to not do it when you see a set of letters printed on a page. It's hard to just see them as like dark and light areas as opposed to letters that form words. Yeah, it is. So yeah, it's a kind of structure generating machine in the sense that generating. I don't know if generating is exactly the right word, but it's a capacity to sort out a structure from a signal that can be very heterogeneous. So yeah, like all the different, you think of all the variations of color, font, orientation, etc., that we can still recognize words. And like you think of for example, you don't see these as much anymore, but captchas where it's like a word with like weird lines all over it, and you can still recognize the letters. And the idea is that it's much harder for computers to recognize the letters when they're covered with lines and weird sort of the letters are like bent and warped and stuff. But humans are capable of performing this task with sometimes a little bit of difficulty, but at least within a few seconds. So yeah, like we receive a signal that can be have all sorts of different sort of support or carriers, like different colors, different shapes and so on. But we can extract from this signal some sort of meaningful message that this is the letter A or this is the word apple. We use all sorts of mechanisms that evolved for different purposes, like probably observing the signs of traces of an animal, like the tracks that an animal has left behind. Like maybe this sort of capacity to notice details and piece them together into like a meaningful structure. Maybe this capacity goes into like our capacity to read. But yeah, so it's like how to extract a sort of invariant meaning from a varying input that can, in a way that, and like very quickly and sort of quasi-automatically, without any like conscious effort of, deciphering what the signal means. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. I'm not sure, 61, if you are able to read at this point, or if not, I can read this bit. Okay, no worries. I'll read this part. Thus, the older physiology was not mistaken in drawing a parallel between nerve activity and the operations of consciousness, but the method of elementary analysis, which decomposes the whole into a sum of real parts, disassociated the nerve functioning into a mosaic of juxtaposed processes, distributed them among autonomous centers, and reduced acts of consciousness to the association of real contents or to the combined interplay of abstract faculties. The parallelism obtained was illusory. Local excitations can still be made to correspond to isolated sensations, but it is on the condition of working in the artificial milieu of the laboratory experiment. And the excitations as well as the sensations obtained in this way are not the integrating elements of normal nerve functioning or living consciousness. The discrediting of realistic analysis in psychology as well as in physiology brings about the substitution of a functional or structural parallelism for this parallelism of elements or content. Quote-unquote mental facts and quote-unquote physiological facts are no longer brought together in pairs. It is recognized that the life of consciousness and the life of the organism are not made up of a collection of events external to each other like the grains of sand in a pile, but rather that psychology and physiology are both investigating the modes of organization of behavior and the degrees of its integration, the one in order to describe them, the other in order to determine their bodily foundation. Until now, we have limited ourselves to summarizing the ideas concerning which the authors are in agreement, that is, in short, to criticizing psychological and physiological atomism. It remains to be seen under what categories the phenomena brought to light by this critique can be conceptualized positively. In the theory of central functioning, as in that of the reflex, most authors act as if it were sufficient to correct the atomism by the notions of integration and coordination. To our way of thinking, these notions are equivocal. They may represent a genuine reform of psychological and physiological understanding, but they may also represent a simple antithesis or counterpart of atomism. This is what we shall attempt to establish by the analysis of three examples taken from spatial perception, chromatic perception, and the physiology of language. The very facts which call most imperatively for the hypothesis of a global functioning are interpreted in such a way as to take as little as possible away from the atomistic interpretation. It is known that the localization of a perceived point does not depend solely on the location occupied by the excitation on the retina or by the corresponding process in the calcarine area. The simple existence of normal vision in a strabismic subject shows that the spatial values of the retinal points and the points of the calcarine area, which are in one-to-one correspondence with them, can be redistributed. Still more simply, stereoscopic perception of depth shows that two processes initiated by quote-unquote disparate points can give rise to the perception of a single point whose localization is determined by no, quote, local sign, unquote, inherent in the point stimulated, since it depends only upon their separation. The permutation of local signs in cases of this kind is interpreted by Pierron in a purely anatomical language. It is supposed that a spatial value is conferred on the calcarine neurons by their integration into a determined associative and reflex circuit. Thus, the modification of their spatial values could be understood only as the establishment of new connections. We are told nothing concerning the causes which could evoke this reworking of synchronizations and regulate it in such a way that the points on the two retinas on which the same object is projected are connected in pairs. The very influence of the stimuli itself would probably be invoked here. Projection of the image of an identical object on two non-corresponding points of the retinas, that is, in classical vocabulary, the disparity of the images, would in some way invoke the integration of these 2 points in the same associative circuit. But Kafka has rightly pointed out the anthropomorphic element in this notion of retinal disparity. An external observer who knows that the same real point is projected on two non-corresponding points of the retinas can speak of disparity. But the eye does not know that these two images come from the same object, and the question is precisely to understand how perception makes them fuse. I think maybe I'll stop here. Right, so here, so the previous parts that we've been reading are a sort of criticism of the atomistic theory, and now the question is, like, what do we substitute for this atomistic theory? So how do we get beyond this negative side to a positive conception of what physiology and psychology of perception and cognition should be doing? One way of trying to get beyond atomism would be just to sort of add on top of the atomistic conception of sensation something like integration or coordination, like these extra functions that would sort of grasp the sensations and put them together in some sense. One easy example of this kind of coordination function would be in the case of stereoscopic vision. So the fact that we perceive, we have one visual field that we perceive, even though we have two eyes that are involved in perception. So in some sense, so you can close one eye and still have visual sensations. You can still see, color areas in front of your eye, and you close the other eye and see color areas in front of the second eye. But then when you open both eyes and look at the world, you don't see like two different color areas. you see a world of objects arrayed in front of you in space, and in particular, you have depth perception in the sense that you can look at an object and perceive roughly how far away from you that object is. And it was already clear in early 20th century psychology of perception that precisely the difference between your two retinal images was involved in some way in this perception of the distance of an object, so in-depth perception. So like if the object is very far away, if you're looking, I don't know, at a mountain in the distance or something, the two retinal images will be quite similar, because the angle is relatively narrow. Whereas if you look at like if you put a finger like right in between your eyes, like just over your nose, the two retinal images are very different because the angle is quite wide. Like the angle from which your left eye sees the finger and the angle from which your right eye sees the finger are almost opposite each other. So in this case, you do actually see, or depending on what the distance is, you can actually make yourself see a double finger. But this is sort of an exceptional case. But then like objects in like middle distance, like a few meters away from your eyes, you still see them as one object, but you perceive them as at a distance of a few meters. So the degree of difference between the two retinal images is somehow used to bring about a perception of the distance of the object. And so like one way of explaining this, or setting out like what is happening, is just to say that you have like a set of sensations on one eye, and a set of sensations produced by the other eye, and then there's some sort of region of the brain or some function in the brain that takes those two images and like measures what is the difference between them, and then based on that measure, it sort of computes what the distance of the object must be to bring about that kind of perception, or that set of pairs of sensations. But what Merleau-Ponty here sort of points out, or like the type of criticism he's going to develop here, is that this already sort of presupposes that your eye or that region of your brain knows that there's one object to sort of measure the distance from. Like it's only if you know that retinal image A and retinal image B are actually images of the same object that it makes sense to try to figure out what the difference is between them. And so like in certain experimental settings, there's these like devices that you can use to project two different images on each eye, and what the subject actually ends up seeing is not like some sort of joint like I don't know hybrid of the two images, but they instead see one image or the other, and it sort of alternates. Like at first you see the image projected on your left eye, and then you see after a few seconds the image on your right eye, and then after a few more seconds back to the left eye, and so on. So in this case, you somehow are like the images don't fuse, whereas in the case of the regular perception of an object a few meters away, you actually do perceive one object, despite the differences in the retinal images. But like how, like if you want to account for regular stereoscopic vision in terms of measuring the disparity between the two images, then somehow your eye and visual regions of the brain have to know like this is actually just two images of the same object, and so it makes sense to measure the difference. Whereas in other instances, like this sort of laboratory setting with the two different images, these two images are too different from each other, or they don't depict the same object, so it doesn't make sense to measure the difference. So like you're still like you haven't really gotten any further, or you've only sort of displaced the problem, because now you still have to figure out like how is it that we are able to recognize that these two images are of the same object. And this is not something that you can sort of express in terms that are local to one eye and then a coordination between the two eyes. Like somehow this recognition of one object has to happen before even you can compare the two eyes with each other, or like logically it's prior to that comparison. So it's like a sort of logical problem with this theory that it has to presuppose that you can recognize that there is one object before you can even do this comparison that is supposed to allow you to perceive the object in the first place.
So, sorry, so I had to turn away for a second, but the line of criticism that he's developing is that in order for this disparation with these two similar images to be resolved, there has to be some way that the mind recognizes that it's the same object in the first place. It's not like it can step outside of itself to see what's really there. And this probably has something to do with the object kind of standing out from the field in the same way on both retinal images.
Yeah, I think it's even like, I don't want to say simpler, but maybe like earlier in the whole process than something like that. It's even like just like, yeah, so for the experimenter who is like manipulating what the subject sees, you're sort of looking at the subject from outside, as you said. Like you can see the object, like I don't know, an apple on the table a few meters away from the subject, and you can see the subject's two eyes, and you can see the angle between each of those eyes and the object. And so like this is sort of what this theory sort of presupposes, is that you're like outside perception. You're looking at the whole perceptual situation from the outside. But of course, the perceiving subject themselves can't sort of step outside of their own perception and see what is the object and what are the angles between the two eyes and so on. Somehow from within perception, within that perceptual situation, you have to be able to distinguish, when is it the case that these two different images are actually images of the same object, and when is it the case that actually I'm getting two different perceptual images that have nothing to do with each other. And it's a sort of circle, because like your experience of your visual perception of an object is precisely supposed to be the result of these two retinal images being fused together. But you can only actually do that fusion if you already know that it's one object in the first place. So like you have to already know what it is you're trying to figure out. Like the fact that there's one object, you have to already know that there's one object before you can even perform this fusion operation to bring about an image of the object, which is supposed to be how you're observing the object in the first place.
Right, and he's gonna he's gonna go into how he thinks that happens. He hasn't laid that out yet, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he's not like here. So again, he's still sort of criticizing other people's theories at this point. He's saying like one sort of immediately obvious way of getting beyond a purely atomistic account of perception would be to add something like integration onto integration or coordination. So you would start with these atomistic sensations, and then you would say, of course, that's not sufficient. We have to add some sort of integration function that connects these different sensations with each other, and then visual perception and stereoscopic vision would be like one example of this kind of function. But then he's going to argue here, and like he's starting this argument at this point, that just sort of adding integration on top of atomistic sensations doesn't really solve the problem. We instead, like ultimately, what we have to be able to understand is how perception is already structured all the way down. Like there's no such thing as a sort of non-structured or atomistic perception that would then subsequently be connected to some other atom of perception and bring about like our sort of experience of a world of objects and the properties of those objects. Yeah, so it like the structure is there from the beginning, is essentially what we have to find a way to understand. So like yeah, the sort of model of what it is to perceive something, it should not be like our sensation of a red dot or our sensation of a particular tone. Our model for what it is to perceive something should be perceiving a melody, which is already something structured.
That's really interesting. I'm interested to see how he develops that, because I think maybe because it's this example that Simondon loves to give of the disparate retinal images. But the way in which Merleau-Ponty develops this argument may have interesting implications for like reading Simondon. If maybe like Simondon is pretty light on epistemology, and I just think it could be interesting to read Merleau-Ponty's position on this against or with Simondon.
Yeah, that was like my main sort of intention in suggesting this book to read after having read Simondon, because they use a lot of the same materials. Like again, this sort of example of the disparate retinal images, but the use that they make of those examples and materials is quite different. So yeah, trying to like contrast them to each other, see like what elements sort of fit together, which ones are different from each other. I think that's sort of the main thing that I'm hoping to take away from this reading of this book together after having read a couple of Simondon books.
That's really interesting. I love that it's the same example.
Yeah, and I think I'm just trying to remember exactly what the sort of institutional connection. Like they did sort of know of each other. I don't remember in detail. I think in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, he cites Merleau-Ponty, or it's like in the sort of acknowledgement section that he mentions him. I can't remember exactly. I'd have to look that up. But yeah, so they were sort of around the same institutions in France at the same time. But of course, they sort of the individuation is dedicated to Merleau-Ponty. So so there's like obviously they were aware of each other's work. They were sort of working on similar themes, but like took very different directions in terms of how they approached those themes. So I think it's an interesting sort of case study of like how people can start from very similar sort of intellectual environments, but develop like quite different accounts of the topics that they deal with, on the basis of similar materials. But yeah, so this notion that perception is like the sort of paradigm example of perception is perception of a melody is one that I think is hard to like. It's very, in some sense, it's quite counterintuitive, because we really feel like perceiving a melody has to involve in some way perceiving each note and then putting them together. Like it feels like logically the perception of each note comes first, and then you somehow connect each note to each other. But that's sort of what the whole book is going to argue against is like, we actually, like, what comes first is the perception of the melody, and each note is only sort of perceived insofar as it fits into that structure in some specific way. So we have to like sort of reorient our thought patterns to allow this idea that you can perceive a melody as such, or you can grasp that melody not just as a sequence of notes that is then sort of secondarily put into a pattern, but you grasp the pattern itself first. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so the comment here is about whole language learning in education, which sort of subordinated the study of grammar to reading and writing. It's not something that I know a lot about, but I know that like in sort of elementary education, in terms of teaching people how to read, teaching kids how to read, there's like different approaches, phonics and I forget the other one, but like the question is like, to what extent do you sort of focus on like teaching kids that this letter makes this sound and this combination of letters makes this sound, and then sort of build up from the bottom up to like recognizing words and sentences? Or on the other hand, do you like start from words and sentences, and sort of allow the kids to like grasp each word as a whole unit? And like obviously there's like, you can't sort of do one in isolation from the other. Like kids have to learn what letters are to be able to grasp words and vice versa. I guess it's a question of emphasis. Like, how much do you focus on one element versus the other? It's something I don't know a lot about, but it's very interesting to try to figure out like how do you bring about this kind, like, so this sort of structured perception or this melodic perception is something that you have to learn how to do in many cases, at least like in the case of reading. Obviously, infants or people that have never been taught how to read will just see a sequence of lines on a page. So you have to learn how to perceive the melody of those lines or like the structure of those lines. But like how exactly we go about learning that is quite mysterious. Like a lot of the time, it seems like it has to do just with like sort of presenting examples, and then eventually the kids sort of catch on without really you having told them what the like explicit structure is. It just sort of takes hold at some point.
Yeah, I really like the melody idea. I mentioned this, I think, maybe it was before we started recording on like the last session, but I was reading a book about Heidegger's reading of Kant, and then also some of Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. And so I was thinking about, schematism and temporalization, but the idea that there's this, a melody is this temporal structure which is kind of grasped as a whole and yet happens in time. I think works well with that reading of Kant. I mean, maybe already with Kant himself and the application of concept in the schematism over time.
Yeah, I mean, the schematism is, of course, one of the most difficult parts of the first critique. Like, he only dedicates like a few paragraphs to what exactly this is, but it plays a sort of crucial role, or at least on some readings, it's a very important element in making everything sort of hang together. But yeah, so I think Kant himself gives the example of like the image of a dog, where like we might have a concept of a dog as a four-legged carnivore that I don't know, barks and whatever, has these other properties, but this concept, like, to be able to apply it to like the set of perceptions that I'm having right now and say like this is a dog, you have to be able to take that concept and sort of I don't know, spread it out over time, or like apply it to a sequence of temporally extended perceptions. Like you never just have like some perception that just checks all the boxes of all the properties of a dog. Like a dog is not always barking or always running or whatever. Although some dogs, it might seem like they're always barking. But yeah, so like you have to be able to connect this sequence of perceptions. Like you see the head, you see the tail, etc. Like from one, yeah, schematizing an annoying dog. Yeah. But yeah, like you see one portion of the dog and then you see another portion, and you have to be able to connect those together and say this sequence of perceptions is an exemplification or schematization of the concept of a dog. And this is like a somewhat mysterious capacity, in the sense that like the dogness is never like present to you as a whole. It's instead this whole sequence, like the fact that the perception evolves in a certain way over time, that like the dog-shaped head doesn't suddenly turn into a I don't know, a pig-shaped body or whatever. But like it's like this sort of harmonious connection of all the different perceptions through time. Yeah, it's a dog-like rhythm of the time slice. So that's a good way of describing it. And so like somehow we grasp this dog-like rhythm or melody or whatever you want to call it, and grasp it as precisely the rhythm or melody of a dog. And like this is obviously a very sort of simplistic example, but like yeah, any sort of concept that we have that we can recognize an object as falling under that concept, we have to be able to sort of recognize that melody or rhythm, because, and this is something that Husserl talks about, is that precisely one of the sort of essential properties of perceptual experience of physical objects is that we never grasp everything about the object at the same time. We only ever see one aspect of the object. So like you see one side of it, or you see it in one circumstance where it's like the dog might be running now, but later on it will be sleeping, and so like these you always only ever perceive one aspect of a physical object, and the object itself is made up of an infinite sort of collection of all of these aspects, but structured in such a way like that each one is connected in this sort of harmonious way with the other ones, or this melodic way maybe would be a better word to use. So like, yeah, there's a sequence of dog time slices that all fit together in the way that you expect. So yeah, like any perception of a physical object already involves some sort of grasp of, if I walk around this object and look at it from the other side, I'm going to perceive the back of this object that will be, in some comprehensible way connected to the front of the object, even if I might be surprised that even if it looks like a dog from the front, but I walk around it and it turns out to be a cardboard cutout, still the back and front of the cardboard cutout are connected to each other by a sequence of perceptions that leads from one to the other. So any perception of a physical object involves this kind of temporal extension, at least possible temporal extension, that like, insofar as I grasp something as a physical object, I recognize that I could see it from a different angle, or I could observe it doing something different, or exhibiting some other property that it's not exhibiting now. And so this is like sort of intrinsic to the structure of what it is to perceive a physical object in the first place. Yeah, music and poetry are sort of the most, I guess, temporally oriented forms of art. So something like a statue or a painting is, of course, your experience of it, insofar as it's a physical object, is extended through time. You see a painting by looking at one region and then another region, and somehow, grasping that they're regions of the same painting and how they relate to each other. But the painting as such is something that is already there, and you just have an experience of it through time. Whereas music and poetry, written poetry is a little bit different, but like a musical work, for example, you hear it through time. The work itself is like temporally structured. There's no, like, you have a score that is all written down on a page, for example, but that is considered sort of secondary. It's like a description or an instruction for producing the musical work, as opposed to the work itself. So the work itself has this temporal structure, and then poetry, insofar as it's recited or orally produced poetry, it also has this temporal structure, and what relation that has to the written work on the page is something that probably differs from one poet to another. Like someone like Mallarmé, for example, like the presentation on the page is very important to his work, but others might be more. The presentation on the page might be like less essential to the work itself. But yeah, so like this is, yeah, all the different arts have different sort of relationships to this temporal structure, and so music is probably the most like temporally oriented of the art forms. It'd be very interesting to sort of look at art from the perspective of schematization, or this sort of melodic perception as like some essential component to what it is to perceive in the first place. Okay, so maybe we can go on to the next bit. So we're at "Will It Be Claimed" on page 77. If I think Angus, you and I think are the only ones who are able to read today. So if you want to take the next bit.
Yeah, no problem. I can read. Will it be claimed that the two stimuli are immediately indicated as identical by their resemblance, which latter is an objective characteristic? But one of Helmholtz's experiments shows that it is not the similitude of two retinal images which provokes the integration of the corresponding processes into a single circuit. I think this is a quote from Helmholtz. If a white piece of paper marked with two black dots B and A is presented on one side of a stereoscope, and on the other, a black piece of paper with two white dots B1 and A1, which are closer together, then when the left eye fixates on B and the right on B1, dots A and A1 are seen as a single dot on a plane situated behind the plane B1. In this case, however, the dot on the right retina corresponding to the one where A is projected is a black dot like A itself. The dot on the left retina corresponding to the one where A1 is projected is white like A1 itself. The two dots A and A1 do not present any common qualitative characteristic. They have nothing in common except being dots on a homogeneous ground. Thus, it is the function completed by a stimulus in the constellation in which it is integrated, which is determining. This is the equivalent of saying that the permutation of local signs in the Calcarine area is not a phenomenon which can be accounted for point by point. The permutation takes place in each point according to what is demanded by the whole. It is indeed, if you wish, the disparity of images which is the cause. But this disparity is a physiological reality only if it is represented in the visual sector by forces which tend to relate similar excitations. And this similarity exists only with regard to the function completed respectively by each of these excitations in the whole of which it is a part. The projection of two identical images on two non-corresponding points of the retinas is never sufficient as a local phenomenon to produce an effect. One of Jansch's experiments, interpreted by Kafka, shows that two luminous filaments on a black ground, even when they are unequally distant from the subject, are seen as situated on the same plane. But once they are presented in full light, they are arranged in depth. It is reasonable to attribute the difference of the effects to the difference of the circumstances, the localization in depth to the presence, in the second case, of a ground of objects which are projected on the retina at the same time as the two threads. This ground reinforces the disparity of the two images of the thread, which remained inefficacious until then. Thus, the localization in depth assigned to the thread and the spatial value of the excitation which it projects depend, in the final analysis, on those of the whole field. Since the same reasoning could apply to each of the points which it is believed, quote unquote, compose it, it follows that the disparity of retinal images and the attribution of a spatial value are not punctual phenomena, but phenomena of structure. They do not depend on the properties of the excitation in each place or in all places, but result from the properties of the whole as such. Maybe I'll do one more paragraph. Thus, if we postulate the intervention of a quote-unquote disequilibrium between the excitations coming from the two eyes in the correct perception of a strabismic subject, or in the stereoscopic vision of depth, as one can postulate a disequilibrium between visual excitations and those furnished by the other receptors in order to explain the functional reorganization in hemianopsia, we will only be developing the classical notion of the disparity of images by stripping it of its anthropomorphic character. To the extent that the Calcarine area represents a punctual projection of the retina, and to the extent that the retina is treated as a bundle of autonomous nerve terminations, quote, the retina, like the Calcarine area, seems only to have the role of mediating the stimuli. The construction of the total visual field is evidently not the expression of the activity of the Calcarine area. It is only an intermediary which furnishes the materials with the help of which the entire visual field is constructed by the fundamental function of the brain, unquote. Is integration in the associative circuits sufficient to make possible this construction of the spatial field? Psychophysiology had imagined a determined local, quote-unquote, local sign, imagined attributing a determined, quote-unquote, local sign to each point of the two retinas. Experience having shown that local signs are not immutable, Pierron no longer relates their distribution to pre-established anatomical devices in the retinas, but to coordinating circuits. In this way, it is conceived that two non-corresponding points of the two retinas integrated into the same associative circuit can enter into functional relationship and receive the same local sign. But which one? Where does the associative circuit in turn obtain the local specificity which it communicates to the partial excitations? If one thinks that it belongs to it by construction, one is only referring the anatomical theory of local signs to a higher system, and we come up against the difficulties which it has encountered. The spatial localization of a determined excitant is modified by the introduction of additional points into the field. The local specificity of an associative circuit does not belong to and is not inherent in it. It depends on its relations with other associative circuits, which at the same time are distributing concordant local signs to other points of the retina. I wish he had images here of this experiment by Helmholtz. It sounds interesting. But yeah, I guess it seems like kind of the upshot of this section is that there's this structuration which organizes the local excitations, and that these regions of the retina or the calcarine region provide the, I guess, more punctual sensations, which are organized within a structure which is contributed, I don't know, by the brain as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's right in terms of the sort of overall message here. This experiment from Helmholtz is pretty interesting. Yeah, it is a little bit hard to visualize from the description here, but as far as I understand, you have a white piece of paper with two black dots on it and a black piece of paper with two white dots on it, and you present each one of these pieces of paper to one eye using this stereoscope device. And the subject is instructed to look at at one dot in each eye. So the white dot on the black page and the black dot on the white page. And then what happens is the second dot on each page, sort of the two dots fuse together so that you perceive a sort of extra dot. So you're focusing on one dot on each page, and then you perceive a second dot, which is the fusion of the second dot on each of the pages. But the one of the dots is a black dot and the other dot is a white dot. So in terms of quality of perception, there's absolutely nothing in common. They're like completely opposed to each other in terms of the actual sensation that each dot is producing. But what they have in common is that each of them is a figure on some sort of ground. So the white dot stands out on the black page and the black dot stands out on the white page. And so this is a sort of counterexample to the idea that the fusion of the two retinal images would be a result of some sort of objective resemblance between the two images. So it can't be the case that the images fuse together if they're in objective terms sufficiently similar to each other. Instead, there has to be some sort of structuring process, a sort of top-down recognition of what role these two images play in the overall structure of the visual field. Like precisely this figure ground example in the case of the dots is like a very similar, simple instance of this, but more complex ones like a face or something like that would also work. But in each case, what is recognized is not it's not just that that image one and image like the left retinal image and the right retinal image are similar to each other in some objective sense. Instead, there's some sort of structure of the visual field that allows for the two retinal images to be assigned the same role and to sort of bring about this integration or this fusion of the two images when the two images are structured in the right way. Yeah, and then the last bit is also a little bit difficult because he sort of introduces this this problem of if it's not the case that similarity of the two images is what brings about the fusion, then then what is it? What is it that does bring about that fusion? And then so he poses this problem, and then he mentions one sort of possible solution, which would be to say that the two portions of the retina are integrated into sort of one circuit or one they're sort of connected to each other in some physiological sense. So like point A of retina of the left retina is connected to point A of the right retina, and like this connection is what brings about the fact that these two retinal images are fused with each other. And then he sort of immediately goes on to criticize this account. And what he argues here is essentially that this only sort of pushes the problem back to the next level of integration. So like if like retinal region A on the left retina is connected to retinal region A on the right retina through this circuit, there's like a circuit that connects them to each other. Then the question is, how does the circuit that connects like the circuit A that connects the equivalent regions on the two retinas, how is that connected to circuit B that it connects two different regions on each retina? Like there has to be some sort of spatial localization the images of the fused images. So we have to be able to say that the object that I can see using my stereoscopic vision is to the left of this other object, or above it, or whatever. So what brings about the localization of these fused retinal images, or these? How is it that these circuits that connect one retina to the other, how are they spatially localized? And then you have the same problem, because again, you still have to explain, like any attempts to say that it's like some sort of similarity or objective connection between one and the other is going to run into the same kinds of problems. So again, you have to say that there's some sort of structuring, like top-down structuring, that assigns a function to each of these circuits, these sort of higher level circuits that connect the individual retinal regions of each retina. So this, again, it only sort of pushes the problem back to another stage, or like pushes it to a higher level, because now you just have to localize. You're localizing not just individual sensations on one retina. You have to localize the circuits that connect one retina to the other, but you still have the same problem. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next bit. Maybe this will be our last one, depending on how much discussion we have of it. But so I'll go on. I'll read the next bit. We are referred back then to a higher coordinating system. In the same manner, every anatomical conception of coordination will leave the explanation incomplete by always deferring it. There can be no question of anything but a functional conception. This is to say that local specificities are distributed to the associative circuits themselves at each moment according to what is demanded by the equilibrium of the total constellation. One could wonder by what chance the retinal images of two objectively similar points, or ones which exercise the same function in two colored holes, happen precisely to be linked to the same local sign. The problem disappears as soon as the local specificity of associative circuits is assigned to them in each case by the structure of the whole. For then the construction of the spatial field is no longer a centripetal but a centrifugal phenomenon. It is not because two retinal excitations are integrated into the same associative circuit that their mental correspondents receive the same function in perceived space. Rather, it is this common function which designates them to be linked by an associative circuit. Coordination itself appears as a result, the effect of a phenomenon of structure or quote-unquote form. The analysis of the physiological conditions of chromatic perception will lead to the same conclusions. Here again we choose the expositions which H. Pierron gives of them as typical, and we will raise the question as to whether the idea of integration or coordination is sufficient to resolve the difficulties of physiological atomism. Although Pierron rejects the hypothesis of a special center for color vision, he accepts that the receptor cones of the retina are related to a keyboard of chromatic neurons, each one of which is susceptible to the perception of a nuance. The wavelength of the luminous excitant would itself assure the shifting of the nervous influx towards one of the chromatic keyboard notes, which corresponds to the nuance of the light. With regard to the degrees of intensity of the colors, the physiological substrate would again be found in different circuitings. When a differential threshold is crossed, it is because the nerve influx, which until then was channeled toward a certain anatomical device, suddenly shifted toward another circuit. Are we not brought back to anatomical representations which localize the function of chromatopsia and even the different degrees of this function in a certain nerve territory? Although the author nevertheless wanted chromatopsia, stereopsia, and photopsia to be affected in the order of their decreasing fragility in case of lesion. We are dealing with a horizontal localization which attributes certain areas to certain contents. Just as above, with regard to the quote-unquote local signs, we can wonder if the chromatic values assigned to each of the objective points which are projected on the retina really depend solely on the properties of the afferent local influx. The phenomenon of contrast, if we could adhere to the classical interpretation, would not be an obstacle to the punctual analysis of chromatic values related to each part of the field. For Hering's theory, for example, supposes in the most complex cases only a reciprocal action between the area which plays the role of figure and that which plays the role of ground, in which the proper effects of each of the areas are added together. If the contrast of brightnesses is taken as an example, one will reason in the following fashion. White induces black around it. Gray on a black background will appear very clearly because this induction effect reinforces the proper color of the ground. Gray on a gray ground will appear darker and emerge less distinctly because the two gray areas mutually darken each other. A large gray disk on a black ground will appear less clear than little gray pieces of the same nuance on the same ground, since by the same mechanism, the quote-unquote internal contrast causes the different parts of the large disk to darken each other. In this conception, contrast depends only on the size and the geometric distribution of the stimuli. The total effect is the sum of the local effect. Thus, the phenomenon would demand in cerebral physiology only the hypothesis of a reciprocal action of the local influxes, which seems compatible with Piron's schema. But in the case of color contrast, it has been possible to bring to light phenomena which it seems impossible to interpret in the same sense. It is known that a ring of gray paper on a yellow ground appears blue, and on the other hand, that a window illuminated by neutral daylight appears bluish in a room lighted by the yellow light of electricity. Initially, these two phenomena appear comparable. In reality, they are not. While the yellow ground in the first case retains a very strong saturation after the gray ring has been introduced, walls lighted by electricity appear, on the contrary, faded and whitish, and take on a distinctly yellow tint only if they are observed through an opening in the screen. Thus, in the first case, the contrast affects only the figure. In the second, it simultaneously affects figure and ground and consequently accentuates in the first case the difference that one would find between the gray and the yellow in examining them separately, while in the second case, between the apparent blue of the daylight and the whitish yellow of the electric light, the difference is no greater than between the daylight when it is seen as neutral and the electric light when it appears to be a saturated yellow. This is because the second phenomenon obeys a very different law than the first. Everything happens as if the colored light, yellow, of the ground tended to appear neutral, while the objectively neutral light of the figure tended to take on a color complementary to the objective color of the ground. In other words, with the electric light assuming the function of ground or of neutral light, as if the objectively neutral light took on an appearance such that the difference of the objective colors were transposed but maintained in our perception. It is a question of a sort of, quote, shift of level, unquote, by which the color which plays the role of ground becomes neutral, while the color of the figure is modified in such a way that the difference between ground and figure remains invariable. Quote, if two parts of the retina are differently stimulated, no constant relationship will exist between each part of the phenomenal field and its local stimulation. But under certain conditions, there will be a constant relationship between the gradient in the phenomenal field and the stimulus difference, unquote. Perhaps it would be better to find a new name for this new phenomenon which would distinguish it from the first, or to borrow the term, quote-unquote, transformation from Jentsch. In any case, it is no longer a question here of increase, as in the classical phenomenon of contrast, but of transposition of a difference in colors. In the experiments on which Hering's theory was based, color acted on a neighboring color. Hering supposed that the yellow of the ground acted as such on the gray of the figure to modify the appearance. In Kafka's phenomenon, on the contrary, the transposition cannot be related to either of the two terms present or to actions of one superimposed on the other. This point, which is essential for our purpose, can be made evident by a crucial experiment. If the blue color of the figure really results from the yellow color of the ground, the effect should be accentuated by accentuating the coloration of the ground. Therefore, let us place an opaque object on a sheet of white paper in a room lighted by diffuse daylight and by an electric light bulb so that the electric light is screened by the object. Only the daylight penetrates, and this shadow appears to be a saturated blue. If all the surface surrounding the zone of shadow is covered with yellow paper, the coloration of the milieu is reinforced, and the phenomenon of contrast should be accentuated, if the classical theory were true. In fact, the blue coloration of the shadow disappears under these conditions, and all the more completely as the yellow paper employed is more saturated. The result of the experiment does not vary if one arranges to eliminate the difference of clarity between the shadow and the yellow paper, as well as the internal contours of the yellow sheet, factors which are unfavorable to contrast. The result still remains the same no matter what the color of the light used. Inexplicable on the classical thesis, this phenomenon justifies, on the contrary, the notion of color level. At the beginning of the experiment, the yellow light which constituted the ground tended to be manifested in perception as neutral light, and correlatively, the objectively neutral light appeared blue. When its color level is given back to the ground, the condition of the total quote-unquote transformation phenomenon is made to disappear. The apparent color of the quote of the enclosed field does not depend, as contrast theory is maintained, on its own objective radiation of the surrounding field, that is, on two factors which combine in a summative way, but on a gradient between enclosed and enclosing radiation and on the color in which the latter appears. End quote. So this is a bit of a long passage and also somewhat complicated, but I think the general idea, some of the details of this experiment are a bit hard to follow, but the general idea is that color perception and the perception of color contrast in particular is also not explicable in a sort of bottom-up way in terms of sensations of individual colors that would then be joined together in some sense. Instead, what we find is that there are all these sort of top-down phenomena of structuration. So it depends not just, so what color you perceive depends not just on the wavelength of the light that reaches the retina in that particular point, but also on what is the light coming from the rest of the surroundings and striking the retina. And so maybe a simpler example than the one that he's describing here is just that if you if you take a piece of white paper and you look at it during the day near a window when you have sunlight coming in, the paper looks white. But then if you turn on an electric light, the light is slightly yellow compared to the daylight, and the paper will have a sort of yellowish tint to it. But then later on in the evening, or if you close the curtains and look at the piece of paper under the electric light again, now the paper looks normal. It just looks white. And what has happened is that in the first case, you're perceiving the paper with the daylight as neutral, as sort of the ground, the neutral color of light, and then the electric light is perceived as yellowish and gives a sort of yellowish tint to the paper. But then when you close the curtains or it's nighttime and you turn on the electric light, now the electric light is perceived as the neutral color, and the paper, the white sheet of paper that reflects this light, is seen just as white and not as yellowish anymore. And the lesson we can draw from this is that the color that we perceive in a certain region, or the color that we perceive that an object has, is determined not just by the light that object reflects, but also what the surrounding illumination is, and what the sort of perceived background neutral color is in that context. And you can do these experiments, for example, with more extreme coloration, like you take like a red colored light bulb, or you put a red film over a light bulb, and the whole room is like illuminated in a red color. And so when you first walk in the room, everything looks sort of reddish, but then after a few seconds or minutes, everything just sort of looks normal again. But conversely, or like if you take the same lighting and you look at an object through like a small aperture, a small window or whatever into the room, and you look at a white piece of paper in the room, that paper looks red now because it's under red lighting that is not perceived as background. So the same lighting can produce the effect of either preserving the color once that lighting is perceived as neutral, or it can have the effect of changing the color if you perceive it as specific to that object. And it depends on which color. It's sort of like the key of the color that you perceive as the neutral background that determines what color you see the object as having. So here again, we can't suppose that there is something like a sort of isolated color sensation that later on gets integrated with other color sensations. Instead, we have to perceive the whole scene as colored in a certain key, with a certain neutral color as like the central color, and all the other colors are sort of arranged with reference to this other color. So there's a sort of color structure to the scene that we perceive when we see an object as having a certain color, or when we perceive light as having a certain color.
That's very interesting. I can see there's a kind of stylistic continuity between Merleau-Ponty and Simondon in this like endless proliferation of examples from just this series of experiments he just ran through. It reminds me of reading Simondon. Maybe there's more continuity in Merleau-Ponty's examples. Simondon sometimes in the same paragraph can end up someplace completely different from where he started.
Yeah, I think the sort of line of argument, it's a little bit broken up because of the way we're reading it, like sort of just one passage at a time. But I think you can trace the line of argument a little bit more easily in Merleau-Ponty than in Simondon, where, yeah, as you said, you have sometimes these paragraphs where he'll start like, or even a sentence with just like a sequence of semicolons, and like it starts with something about corals or whatever, and then we'll like proceed to, I don't know, something about like human societies, and it just sort of like one thought is just sort of juxtaposed to the next, and you're supposed to figure out how they connect to each other yourself. Whereas here, yeah, each of these experiments is mentioned as like a counterexample, or like an instance of a problem, like for a particular theory. So like if we suppose that there's this sort of integration function that happens after something like an atomistic sensation. So like a perception is brought about through first these atomistic sensations, and then second some kind of integration of those sensations. If we suppose this kind of theory, then we run into these problems, which are exemplified by these different experiments. That's sort of like the argumentative structure of what he's giving us here. But yeah, it can be hard to sort of like you sort of lose track of the thread sometimes because he goes through each of these experiments sometimes in a lot of detail. But yeah, that's like the I don't know, the line through all these different experiments is that he's going through some of these counterexamples that show that you can't hold this sort of simple integration theory as a way of getting beyond atomism. Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop anyway. So yeah, unless there's any sort of final comments on that last bit.
Nothing else from me. I'm just look forward to getting into the positive argument. I guess we've been going through a lot of alternate options he doesn't like, but
yes, but I think I think it's part of what he wants to get across is that you can only sort of grasp this this whatever this exactly melodic perception or rhythmic perception or whatever, like we only grasp it by means of this criticism of the existing theories, and sort of like we sort of appreciate it as necessary by going through these existing theories and seeing how they fail. And so yeah, it is sometimes it takes a certain amount of patience, and like you have to like sort of keep the big picture in mind while going through all these details. But it's I think that's like the trees for the forest kind of effect. It can be hard to keep the forest in mind when we're like examining individual leaves on each of these trees. But that's sort of the approach to what he's doing here. Right. Okay. So we'll end here today. We'll pick up from page what are we at? 82. 82 next time. So thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks for your contributions. And hope to see you next time.